There are 1,000,000 ways to die. We just wanna talk about it. CodeHeads.
Hello, CodeHeads.
Good
That's what-
morning.
So thank you guys for joining us again. We love coming and code heading. And actually, one of my colleagues this week was like, "Oh, what's that? What's the name of your podcast? The Code Nerds?" And I was like, "No, but that was a suggested name."
Oh, nerds. All right.
Yeah, I believe I suggested, why don't we just be like the Code Nerds? And then we came to Codeheads. But similar sentiment. We are nerds that like codes. But you're not nerds because you're awesome. You're Codeheads who follow us. So this week, is along the same vein of being a nerd, we wanted to talk about actually the history of CPR because it's kind of interesting and it dates back super duper far. And we're gonna try and focus on more of the modern things, but Mike and I at further dates are gonna talk to you guys about some of the really cool things that were tried and the trials and tribulations of many of the different folks throughout history.
Yes. I mean, to get to the point where we are today, where everything feels so standardized, it took a lot of experiment, to say the least, a lot of ingenuity, very clever practitioners, risk takers too, in fact. So it is wildly entertaining and informative. And that's why we're so excited to break some of these experiments, some of these situations down for you.
Right. And I think that's why we love like I love innovation. I love people who are like, I love people who are like, oh yeah, those are guidelines. I'm gonna do my own thing. Because I'm really, I'm drawn to people like that are like, "Ooh, I'm gonna sniff this out and see where this brings me." But some of the some of the quote unquote experiments back in the day were pretty wild.
And I think people would look at those innovators as whack jobs with some of
Oh,
the experiments that they would try to perform. It's like when Galileo said, "No, we're not the center of the universe." They wanted to burn him at the stake. And
oh, for sure. It's that out
they,
of the box thinking, right? That either gets you in the sanitarium at that time or really makes some modern leaps for,
yeah,
for medicine.
yeah.
Um, and sometimes both. A little this, a little that. Um, but yeah, and so we're gonna get into that because I mean, I think that if you guys follow us and listen to us, you guys probably have a similar interest. And we've heard from folks that they also have interest. So we're going to get into the history of to give an example of how far back people have talked about essentially CPR and resuscitating others. Goes back all the way to ancient Egypt to like 2686 BC, which is mind boggling to me. That's like just ye olden times and then some. Um, but
Right.
they refer to the breath of life. And that's really with Isis resurrecting Osiris. And I don't know if you know a lot about ancient Egyptian history, but Osiris is um a god king and the god king of fertility, and something happened, he had chopped up, there's a whole thing about that, but Isis is the powerful goddess of magic and motherhood and healing. Basically she's me. And um essentially she goes and finds her, her husband Osiris's body, and she goes and she breathes into him, and he comes back to life. And so she gives him this big breath, and he comes back just for a short period of time, but he is able to, actually come back to life. And so they referred to that as the breath of life. And from then on, people started doing that in ancient Egypt. When people, passed, they would start, giving a breath. Essentially, they would do rescue breathing. And
So
I think that
approximately 25 years BC, we have our first recorded ROSC, albeit brief.
yes.
Right?
Yeah. just quick, because they didn't have all the other modern things that we have. But I thought that was really interesting that he was able to return from death and, give a quick message and then back to death. But, and there's been references in the Bible and all these other, in ancient Greece. And it's just really interesting how, whether, how much stake you put into these various tales, it is interesting that even these thoughts and tales came back so far from history. So
Mhm.
I'm going to fast forward because, as we just alluded to, there was a lot that happened in like the 18th and 19th century to kind of start getting us on our way to where we, essentially are now with CPR and with saving people. And it makes it feel I go back to the history because sometimes I feel like we're hemming and hawing over, like, how often we're ventilating people and, the rate of compressions and the depth of compressions and, which is all really important to get those quality measures and to really do the best for people. But sometimes people get so stuck on, the breaths and how fast we have to do everything and da da da. And there's so much pressure on us with CPR and, when we train BLS and when we're training lay people. And I go back to these things in history and I'm like, well, they just kind of like, messed around. They found out and they still made it work sometimes. And obviously we know better. And so we do focus on those quality measures. But whenever I get kind of like stressed out or I feel like, oh, like making any difference and getting any quality outcomes in CPR and in resuscitation responses is so like annoying. And it's so like nitpicky. I think back to the history, but I digress. Um, so I wanted to just point out that actually in 1874, we
Mhm.
had the first open chest cardiac massage that was described. So essentially, they did surgery, they cracked the chest, and they just figured, hey, let's give it a squeeze and see what happens. And it was actually semi successful for a while. And they were like, "Oh, this works. We're doing it just like the heart." Um, and then cut to 1891, Dr. Frederick Moss, he did the first external chest compressions in humans. It was the first time someone said, "Oh, well, we can squeeze it inside. I wonder if their chest is closed and their heart's not working if we, do that from the outside, if we still get the same squeeze." Um, and that was the first time it was actually documented as, compressions.
and and which obviously would mitigate risk by doing it externally. And so I'm wondering if what prompted, that tactic. Was it, not just reducing risk from the traumatic aspect of that, that intervention, but also what about infection? I'm putting my hand right inside the heart, feeling
Right.
around, squeezing. What about causing damage to accessory vasculature, etc.?
Yes, and that was a big thing back then, right? It's not like they had gloves, they didn't have aseptic technique, they didn't have, hand sanitizer, you know? Yeah, they were, you know
Just the bathroom.
yeah, wiped with my hand. Let me go squeeze that heart. And that's but but that was the biggest risk back then, like, people were washing in the same bin of water, before like, there were things that they were doing, but, like, the biggest risk to most people at that time was dying of infection, after any sort of medical procedure. So, food for thought there. I mean, don't think too much about what we just said about wiping with your hand. I mean, but it's interesting because then it, jump to the 20th century and in 1924 is when the AHA was really founded. And it was just six cardiologists who came together and they were essentially, I mean, not like I was just about to say they're doing what we did. And they're not. But they went back through documentation and they were looking for, science to help and reinforce that there is something to this, that there is something to just focusing on the heart and there's a way to be able to save people from sudden cardiac arrest and when your heart stops working. Um
And
And I
that's an
thought,
astonishing
yeah,
discovery if you think about it. Like your dead is potentially no longer, definitive, which
right.
that would surprise me at the time. It's like, oh, they're gone. But no, we actually might have a way to bring these people back.
And people probably thought they were kooky in the
Yeah,
1920s.
you're nuts.
I mean, they're all like grapes of wrath in the middle of the Depression, and these guys are like, actually, I got one more, you
Mhm.
know? We're gonna found the American Heart Association, which, is a big task. And I mean, look what it's become from
Wow.
that one idea from these six guys, which they were all men at that time. And what it's become. And even though they founded it in 1924, it really wasn't until the 1960s where like the birth of modern CPR kind of happened. Mike, one of your favorite guys.
Guy Knickerbocker?
You got it.
Guy Knickerbocker, in which the acclaimed show The Nick, and not very well known show at the same time, was made. And we are going to get into that show and some of the procedures with our nugget nodes.
Yeah,
But
so any code heads that have not seen The Nick on HBO, watch it because we're gonna.
mandatory. Yeah.
Yeah, it's mandatory. If you want to be our friends. I'm just kidding.
And I mean, just to mention, he was undeterred by like the high mortality and from sepsis or it's the pre-antibiotics era.
Yep.
He talk about pushing boundaries.
Yeah.
Um, and his private life was also intriguing, but we could
Yeah.
that
We
might be a
get into that
digression.
on a different.
But that's for the TV show. Watch the TV show.
Yeah. But yeah, fascinating man, but true innovator. I mean, true out of the box thinker, innovator. But so Guy Knickerbocker, along with a couple other people, they actually got published in JAMA, which actually for doing closed chest compressions along with mouth to mouth ventilation, which essentially was the first time CPR as we know it was done. And that's when actually the AHA started promoting CPR and CPR training for people other than for healthcare providers and people other than healthcare providers. They just started saying, let's do this. This is CPR. We need to do these compressions and give breaths. And that's what's going to save people, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Um, and they actually, a couple years later in 1963, then created their first CPR committee, which is now, where we get our guidelines from, which has become such a huge thing.
Yep.
And they actually in 1966 created their first guidelines. That's when the first, research-based standardized CPR guidelines came out from the AHA. And I think that's really wild because in some ways, I feel like it's not that long ago. I mean, in some ways, it's ages ago, right? But in
60.
other ways, like when you think about the history of everything, like 1966 isn't like, I mean, people from 1966 are still alive and like, it's
Yeah.
pretty cool. I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, it's just, maybe I'm just a super nerd, but it doesn't seem that, it doesn't seem that long ago. And in the 1970s is when really it started becoming like wildfire that we started doing more CPR and really expanding into the lay people. That's when they started doing like PSAs and public
Yeah.
service announcements. I guess that's what a PSA is, just to reiterate that one. But they really started, growing their programs for not just hospital providers, but specifically for lay people, for both the American Heart Association and the American Red Cross. And I'm going to kind of maybe blow your mind. Also, is that in 1991 is the first time the AHA introduced the chain of survival, which I thought was like, that was like a big concept then. Like, oh, there's a chain of survival to early access and early CPR and early defib, like putting all this stuff
Yeah.
together and show people like this is what actually saves lives. And then the first guidelines with ILCOR, like internationally, weren't done until 2000. Like
Wow.
not long ago. I
Not long
really
ago at all.
thought that was done a lot longer. Like, and I feel like that's something I should know because I'm such a nerd. And um, but yeah, not until 2000 did ILCOR pull that together. And then hands-only CPR didn't become a thing until between 2005 and 2010, which
Mhm.
seems real late. Um, but it was really fascinating to me because I feel like all of these things are just part of, my DNA because it's what I've done for so long and what I've focused on and
Right.
my passion. But these things haven't been around for all that long. Like all of these modern things that we kind of nitpick about and all these guideline expectations. And maybe that's why some of them are so hard to ingrain, maybe in some of the older folks, because they really didn't have to do it. It really was the Wild West until
Mhm.
probably, until around 2000, 2005, when, ILCOR, like finally internationally, everyone was like, yes, this is what we need to do. These are the guidelines. And every 5 years, we're going to update them, you know? And we weren't holding people to quality standards, until really much
I mean,
later.
that's true. It's so specified, and it almost appears like black and white, sort of what we're supposed to do. And
Right.
the complexity is not revealed within these practices.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much going on with this. And I think we're going to get a little bit more into it when we talk about the folks that were really kind of had those harebrained ideas that even got us to the points that we talked about today for both defibrillation and CPR. So,
People you might
let's-
not expect. People you might not
yeah,
expect.
we
All right.
hope you guys found this as fun as we did. And we hope you nerd along with us. And, we're giving you that homework of watching the Nick, maybe watch the Pit too, because we're going to have some exciting stuff coming up. And hopefully you guys like it. So email us. I'm not going to tell you to reach out and touch us, but try it. All right. Thank you, Codeheads, for being a part of us.
There are 1 million ways to die. We just wanna talk about